All right. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 24, if you want to follow along in your Bibles. And this is the second part of the introduction that Moses gives. From here to the end of from the beginning to the end of chapter 3 is Israel moving into position. They're at Mount Pisgah, Pisgah. I'm not sure how you say that. And this is where Joshua, as we turn to Joshua chapter 1, they're going to come across and take Jericho and Ai, and they'll go in that direction. So last week we covered from them being on the south side, moving around, and they went through 2 or 3 different nations, and they did not fight them because they were related to them. The Edomites belonged to Esau, that was a brother of Jacob, and Lot's 2 sons. Each was a nation, and they were related to Abraham as a nephew, so they didn't fight them. So I decided to stop at 23 because starting in 24, we're going to start having a few wars, and so the nature changes a little bit. And so that's the reason we're doing 2:24 all the way to the end of chapter 3. Lord willing is what we will cover. To introduce it, if you'll notice on the notes, I talked about how I lose stuff all the time. And y'all may not be that way. If you have a husband, you probably have a husband that is that way. Taylor laughs at me when I leave the building because I go outside, I get in the truck, and I realize I left my phone in the office. So then I get back out of the truck, come back in, and I get my phone, and I go back out to the truck, and then I realize I don't have my key. So then I come back in, and I get my key, then I realize I forgot a book I need to take home, and she just thinks it's the funniest thing watching me go back and forth. And so I've taken to going to another room in the office and just sitting there and trying to think, okay, what have we forgotten? Okay? Now, you're probably not that way.
I thought it was my age.
You thought it was age?
That sounds just like me.
Oh, I don't know. It's not age. No. Yeah, a pre-flight checklist. You know, that might be an idea. Just put that stick-it note on the dash. And okay, mark before you drive off this and this and this. And Rhonda's even said a few things about me doing this at the house when I leave, you know.
Make those things where you can sit there and you can just flip them.
Yeah, you know.
You do one, go to the next one.
Huh? I was born like, yeah. Yeah, when I was in middle school, they made me tie my house key into my shoelaces. So when I got home, I could just take off my shoe and open the door.
It's also a
Yeah, that was, yeah, okay.
It's also a sign of a busy man.
It's a sign of an intelligent person. That's what it is. We got everybody? Over there. Yeah, over here. And then Nunu over here. Yeah, all right. That'll work. And so, I mean, it's to the point where, like, even when I leave the dogs in the house, they're not ready for me to leave until I've been back 2 or 3 times. So the way I try to put it in the notes is when you're leaving a hotel, say you're on vacation or you're on a business trip or whatever, when it's time to leave, are y'all the kind that has to look under the bed and in the closet and make sure you didn't leave anything? Okay? Yeah. You know, you just check. Because it's hard when you get home, you know, to have them mail it to you or whatever else it might be. When I was putting this lesson together, I was thinking to myself, okay, that makes more sense to more people than like how bad it is for me. So I put it in that way. That is, if you think about that concept of right before you go in, you need to make sure you have everything right. That's a concept of what's happening here at the end of chapter 2 and the end of chapter 3. We're going to have 3 issues going on. Issue number 1, we are finally coming into contact with the Amorites, who we also know as the Canaanites. They have spread to this side of the Jordan River. And so we've got to start this battle. We've got to clear this land, which is here. That's issue number 1. We've got to get everything ready so when we attack, thank you, man. Now I got to remember to give it. All right. We've got to make sure when we attack through Jericho across the Jordan River, there's nobody on the backside who's going to attack Israel from the rear. And so we've got to clear that area out. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, you've got some tribes who love their stuff too much. And we've got to figure out how to work through that situation. And so we've got to fix that. That's problem number 2 that we're going to take care of. Problem number 3, Moses has been in charge for 40 years. And he is not ready to give it up. He says he's ready to give it up, but the last moment, he's not sure that he wants to hand it over to Joshua. We're not quite there yet. And so those are the 3 things that we're going to clear up as we go through. Make sure you get one of these here. You want one? I know. See, everybody was late to class because Sam announced there was food. And you don't get brethren moving quicker than saying, there's food back there. All right. So those are the 3 issues. The issue with making sure it's cleared out before you begin the attack, making sure we handle these 2.5 or 3 tribes, and making sure that this leadership transition is going to go as smoothly as it needs to go. Those are the 3 things that we're going to be working on and going through. Now, I don't have a map, but I've got a Bible, so just look at my Bible, all right? We're going to say this is a promised land right here, okay? This is Israel, northern kingdom, southern kingdom, right? Dan's up here, Beersheba's here, Jerusalem's going to be here, Jericho's going to be here, all right? So in your mind, this is Israel. Now, when Israel left Egypt, they went to Mount Sinai. Egypt's going to be here. Mount Sinai is going to be about here. It's 11 days' journey from Mount Sinai coming up the King's Highway to right here. Now, as many people as you have traveling, it's going to take a little longer than 11 days. But they're at Sinai for a year, receiving the law, figuring out this old covenant stuff. And then they travel up, and they come right up here to this point. And from the bottom is where they send in the 10 spies. And so as they send in those 10 or 12 spies, as they send in 12 spies, they run across Sisera and his chariots. They run across a lot of giants, a lot of really mean guys. And so 10 come back and say, the land looks great, but those guys are too big. Fortifications are too big. Joshua and Caleb say, our God's bigger than them. We can handle it. Yes, ma'am, Debbie? Yeah.
When you say Israel, you're talking the group of people, Israel, moving up. Correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, just that's for my...
Yeah, it's not the land area. Yeah. We call them different things depending on where we're at in the Bible. If you look at them before they enter into the land, as you look through from Genesis to Deuteronomy and the first part of Joshua, they're usually called the Hebrews. Okay? Now, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, so then we call them the Israelites. Hebrew is a word which means hairy, and they were famous for their beards. And so they were the hairy people. We know them as the Hebrews, which came up. And then they turn into Israel, and they're the Israelites. And that is from about Joshua all the way up to captivity, which would be about 586. And then in 586, they go into exile. And as they go into exile, they get known by their name again of Harry, and Hebrew is changed to Jew. And so after the exile, they're mainly known as the Jews. And so from there, going through the New Testament, you have the Jews. So you have the Hebrews, the Israelites, and the Jews. Now, in a sense, some of those are interchangeable, but that's the reason those names come there. So that's what you're working with. And so they come here. It doesn't go well, so we go back and we wander for 38 years. And then God tells them, okay, it's time to go. And they travel up, but instead of going through the south, they come around the side. The Jordan River's right here, Dead Sea's right here, and we're going around the Dead Sea, and we're heading up. And right here are the 2 kingdoms we're about to destroy. And then we're going to work our way up to where Jericho is. Sea of Galilee is up here, Dead Sea is here. We're like halfway between the 2. And so now, why would they go in the side? Because God said so. All right? Why did they go in the side? You read in the book of Joshua, they were intimidated just taking on the entire land. So Joshua's time, God had them come in, and they would take out Jericho, they'd take out Ai, and they would work their way all across and divide the land of Canaan in 2. So in Joshua, you got 3 campaigns. You'll go through and you'll split it, and then you go take out the southern nations, and then you come back and take out the northern nations. Now, they kind of ran out of steam at the end of Joshua and didn't do a very good job of taking out all these northern nations, but they did for the most part. And so it's a 3-pronged thing, which you see in the book of Joshua, of how that worked, okay? So don't have a map, but that's what we did. All right. So we're traveling through, and as we go, we're nearing this place, moving Israel into position where we can cut the place in half. And as they come through, they've gone through Moab and the Edomites and the Ammonites. And now we're at the Amorites. See that R in there? Amorites. Amorites are pretty much synonymous to what we call Canaanites. And there'll be Canaanites later. And so as they go through there, God says, attack them. And Moses sends envoys through. But of course, they're going to attack and they're going to fight back and forth. Now, why did God want to kill the Canaanites? A lot of people who don't like the Bible and want to accuse Christianity of being terrible, they call it genocide, and they say, well, why would God kill the men, the women, the children, sometimes even the cattle of all the Canaanites? Why would that happen? Yes, sir.
As I recall, most of those nations would use their children and sacrifice them to false gods.
Right, yeah.
And God was very displeased with them.
Yeah, they used their children and worshiped the false gods.
That was their culture.
And it very much was. Yeah, very much was their culture. They were very evil people. Now, reading through our Bibles, Genesis 10, remember you have your Ham, Shem, and Japheth? All these are from Ham. They're the grandsons of Ham, which would be Canaan. Yes, sir?
When you sit there and completely annihilate a people, God eliminated the possibility of them polluting and corrupting.
Right, the influence which would come back. Yeah. Deuteronomy 1:44, when Israel was rejected because that they were rebellious, they realized they didn't want to die in the desert, so they decided to have an invasion force anyway without God's pleasure. And so they attacked, and it says the Amorites ran them off just like bees. And so if you can imagine being around a hornet's nest or a wasp's nest, that's what they were like when they attacked. So this is kind of revenge on that. And if you go back to Genesis 16:15, God tells Abraham these people are going to be destroyed when their sin is fulfilled. They have 400 years to repent, and they never do. They get worse and worse and worse. In the days of Abraham, the king of Jerusalem, or Salem back then, would be Melchizedek. And he was such a righteous priest that Abraham gave him a tithe, worshipped under him. You have several other righteous people and unrighteous people. By the time that you get to this point, all the people in Canaan are pagan. And they are not just unbelievers, but they are terrible, terrible people. And so God has them to go through and to attack. And so as they get ready to go, you'll notice as you read through there, God placed within the people that they were going to attack a dread. And your translation is going to say a dread or a fear. It's not just a, man, I don't want to have to go do this, I don't want to have to take a test in school. Not that kind of thing. It was, imagine your worst fear, multiply that times 10. That's what's going on. And you see even in Joshua chapter 2 and verse 9, when Rahab takes in the spies and hides them, what does she tell them? She says, we're scared to death of you. We've heard what happened to Egypt. We've heard what's happened to all these other tribes. Rahab had learned to be scared of them. And so there was an inherent fear within them of what Israel was going to do. And you'll notice, I keep going to Joshua because we're almost there. In Joshua, it's not all that often that Israel's actually fighting. Now, the army's there, they've got their swords, and they go, but God is the one knocking down the walls. God is the one bringing hail and storms from the sky to kill everybody before they face Israel. God is always doing these things, and they're scared to death of God because they see what God is doing as this goes through. One of the interesting things here, King Sihon, he hardens his heart. God hardens his heart. What does that mean? Usually we look back in Exodus and we see where God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Did Pharaoh not have a choice? He did. Okay? So what's it mean that God hardened his heart?
Because when you challenge someone that's stubborn, they just get more stubborn.
Okay.
And that is a law of God.
Yeah. You challenge somebody who's stubborn, they'll either go one way or the other way. The New Testament example we like to use, Acts 2, when Peter preaches the gospel, the people are cut to the heart. And when they're cut to the heart, what do? They repent and cry out, what do we need to do? We'll do whatever it takes to be right with God, right? Acts 7, Stephen preaches a similar gospel, talking about Israel turning away. And when the people hear him, they're cut to the heart, and what do? They gnash their teeth, they attack Stephen and put him to death. Both cause a reaction, that cutting of the heart, but their previous attitude gets more so, whatever else it may be. It's increased, whatever it might be. There's a lot of Calvinistic, Augustinistic theology here. Some people say, well, is God in charge? God hardened their heart. God is sovereign, and he determines what people are going to do. And that's true. Other people say, no, each one of us makes our own decision, and each one of us answers for ourselves, and that's true. What's hard for us to comprehend is God's in charge, but we still have choice. Let me illustrate it this way. God knew before I was even created, before I was even born, whether I'm going to go to hell or not, or heaven, right? God knows, even before I was born, where my eternal destiny would be. He knows, because he sees the past, he sees the future, he knows exactly how this is going to work out. So does that mean that I don't have a choice in the matter? No, we all have a choice, right? Choose you this day who you will serve, We have a choice, and so God's sovereignty is over all things, but our choice is over all things. And so God is so powerful. This goes back to it goes back to an old debate back in the 1800s with James W. Harding. The way he described it was, God is powerful enough to still pre-will everything and still give us choice. And we don't think God's that powerful. We think it's an either or, and God says it's and. He's in charge of both sides of it. And so the king of Sihon hardens his heart. Now, that was a free choice which he made, but he hardened his heart because God is using him for a purpose. God needs to wipe these people out because of their sin, and God needs to bring his people through and have this land. And so God's sovereignty is in charge, and man's free will is in charge. All right, that is a hugely deep subject. Anybody have a comment, question, or anything? It does. And it's one of those deep things where it's hard to figure it out. Because we live in a very temporal world where it's either or. God lives in a world where it's and.
Well, I also think sometimes we're fooled into a law of having control, and then something like death hits, and you realize you have no control.
No, yeah, God's in charge of all things. Yeah, absolutely. And we mess up thinking sometimes we're in control. And so you'll read there a little bit deeper in the notes. Romans 9, Israel was having the same issue because Paul talks about how God's allowed to decide who is his people and who's not his people. The children of Israel in Romans 9 are saying, wait a second, we're Israelites. We're children of Abraham. We have the generations of promise given to us. And so God has no right to cut off physical Israel and implant or graft into church. And Paul's response, when you read through Romans 9, God can do whatever he wants. And God is doing what he wants. There's still a remnant of Israel, and that would be Paul and all those converts, all those people who are converted who are Jews. But the Gentiles are grafted in, and they also, by faith, are children of Abraham. So, good stuff when you work through it and try to figure out all these things as it goes. All right, so there we go. We conquered the southern area. Now we're headed to the northern area. And so Sihon goes south, Moses goes north. They meet at Jahaz, and Israel defeats them, puts to death everybody. and they're destroyed. Now, Sihon had a king, all right? Doesn't really have much to do with the narrative, but his name was Og. He is the original OG, all right? My kids wouldn't be impressed, but I'm impressed, okay? He's original OG, Og. All right, he's a big guy, all right? He is so big, he can't sleep on a regular bed. It has to be an iron bed, okay? It has to be an extra support Tempur-Pedic bed, all right? Now, on top of that, he is a giant. He is such a giant. How big is his bed? 14 feet, and is it 9 across? 8 feet across. That's our terms, okay? A cubit would be somewhere in the range of 18 inches. Theoretically, a cubit was the area from the elbow to the top of your middle finger, and it belonged to Pharaoh. And so if you had an old Pharaoh or a young Pharaoh, theoretically, you changed whatever the measurement was. Generally, you're looking about 18 inches, about 1.5 feet. And so you're looking at 14 by 6 or 8 or something like that, somewhere in that area. And 14 by 8. So he is a very large man. And Israel has killed many of these giants. This is the last remaining one. And so they come through. I think this giant gets away, but they destroy the nation, and they've cleared all this land, and now everything is free. Okay? So if you go back to my map, all this area now is free. Okay? This is the promised land, what was promised to them, but now we have this area. Now we come across, and as we get to this area in Deuteronomy 3, starting about verse 12, you have these 3 tribes, okay? Reuben, Gad, half tribe of Manasseh. You remember covering this in Bible class? They want this area that's on this side of Israel. And, you cover it in Bible class, and we always say, well, they looked at it, and it was good for cattle. And they had a lot of cattle. And so they wanted this area instead of this area. And so learning about this in Bible class, that always sounded strange to me, because they later had cattle over here. It seems strange. And if you read a commentary, one of the things the commentary will say, Moses mentions how much cattle they have about 8 times in about a chapter. And if you learn about Moses very much, when he mentions something that often, he is aggravated about it. Well, what's going on? As they're conquering all these people, they are accumulating the livestock. And especially these 2.5 tribes have accumulated so much livestock that now it's really hard for them to travel. They're not like they were in the wilderness. They've got so much stuff, it's difficult to go anywhere. And so because it's difficult, they say, Moses, we're all about conquering, but this is good enough. Let's just be here. I've got too much stuff to carry. Like some of those kids who were working with the groceries and bringing them up. Some of them were loaded down. I didn't know if they'd ever leave the foyer. That's the way these people are. They've got too much stuff to carry. So it's a classic Matthew 19:24. Remember what that says? It's hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. They traveled all this way, and they're not going to go to the promised land because they've got so much stuff. It's hard for them to get across the river. It's hard for them to continue traveling as the army as they go across. So what Moses tells them, you're allowed to have this area, but your fighting men have to go with the rest of the nation. And as soon as we conquer everything, then the fighting men could come back. It sounds like a good plan, but in a few centuries, when the northern nations begin to fall to Assyria, they're going to go a generation before everybody else. The Assyrians are going to haul them into captivity because of their worldliness, a generation before the rest of the northern nation goes. So that's an interesting thing to happen. All right, now we're in chapter 3, 21 and 22. Moses has seen all these things, and here they are at the land, and he goes to Joshua, and he says, I want to encourage you. If you are faithful to God, God's going to see you through everything that you go through. And so Moses is very complimentary of Joshua. Complimentary of Joshua, says, you're going to do great. You're going to go over. You see exactly what I'm doing. As long as you follow God, everything works. Then Moses kind of goes into the background and he prays a prayer to God. And what's his request to God? God, I know you told me I can't go into promised land, but God, you're mighty. You're able to change your mind. God, you're gracious. God, I've done so much. Why don't you let me just go ahead and cross over the river and lead them through? Here's a man, 120 years, he was made for a purpose, and that was to take Israel into Canaan. And now that he's reached the end, he knows he has what it takes to do it, and he's like, God, I'm here, let me go. God says, I don't want to hear this anymore. Don't ask anymore. It's Joshua's time. Joshua's going to be the one to lead them through. Why is it hard for us to turn the ministry over to other people? Why is it hard for us to allow somebody else? What you got? Okay, the only one who does it right is me, right? Okay, that's what we usually think. You got to do it like I do it or it's wrong, okay? And a lot of times our ministry is wrapped up in our identity. You know, it happens a lot to preachers, okay? My whole identity is I'm the preacher at the Benton Church of Christ. And, and so if I ever become not the preacher of the Benton Church of Christ, suddenly I'm like, well, who am I? You know, what is my purpose in life? What does it matter? And sometimes we wrap ourselves up. I've always taught this class. I've always done this ministry. I've always done this job. And it's hard to turn it over, especially even to somebody who's qualified and younger and who can do a good job. And it's a difficult thing for Moses to do. And it's interesting, even at the end, he is just grasping because it is so hard to give this up.
Don't you think, though, that it was so important to him and that was his whole life mission?
Yeah.
He didn't even want to do it in the first place.
Right, yeah.
They kept encouraging him to you can be the leader.
Like Brad said last week, you go back to Exodus 4, and Moses says, I don't want this job. I can't talk. I don't even know who you are, God. I don't want to do any of this. And over all this time, it's important to him. He does not want anything to happen to the people. And, you know, it's always scary when you hand it over because that next person may not be as faithful.
I think it just meant something.
It just meant something.
Maybe it would help right the wrong that he did.
Yeah. He's trying to right it. He's trying to make up for some of the mistakes. Man, it's such a hard thing to do. And man, it's so hard to turn over that. It's such a hard thing. All right, let's focus on our lesson in the last few minutes we have. The little box here. All right. You got to prepare for the journey, okay? And you don't have to answer this myself, out loud. On your spiritual journey, did you remember your keys? Did you remember your wallet? Do you remember your phone? Matthew 25, those ladies were there. They didn't have the oil. There's not time to go back. Have you packed? Have you packed for the trip? Are you ready for the journey? And if there's something undone, what do you need to fix? Number 2, you notice Israel is scared to death of these giants in their big iron bed. Do you notice how Israel said, we're just grasshoppers in their height, and they've got these big cities.